What begins as a wedding portrait becomes a curse, a story of desire twisted into ruin, where one family's darkest secret poisoned the land long after they were gone. It was a photograph that should have been unremarkable, another relic pulled from the dust of an estate sale, a keepsake of a family whose name had long since faded from county records. The cardboard mount was yellowed, the edges frayed, yet the image itself remained sharp. A wedding portrait, posed in the formal style of the late 19th century, the groom standing stiffly in his tailored suit, his bride seated beside him in pale satin, the veil pinned back from her face, the bouquets arranged with precision. Behind them, the patriarch stood tall, his hand resting not on his son's shoulder, as one might expect, but against the carved wood of the chair where the bride Saturday. His eyes, fixed by the frozen lens of time, did not rest on the camera. They lingered elsewhere, directly on the young woman at his side. Those who first sifted through the box of ephemera might not have noticed. Old photographs often carried peculiarities, odd gazes, stiff poses, expressions blurred by the slow exposure of the lens. But to study this image longer was to feel unease. The groom's smile did not quite reach his eyes, as though the very act of marriage was shadowed by some private dread. The bride's head turned slightly, her gaze averted from both the lens and her new husband. And the father, his presence seemed less blessing than intrusion, his expression unreadable, poised somewhere between pride and possession. The dealer who offered the portrait for sale gave it little introduction. It came, he said, from the remnants of Hollow Creek Manor, a house abandoned after the war and stripped of its valuables. Most of the lot consisted of letters, tarnished cutlery, and forgotten books, but it was this photograph that drew questions. Who were these people? Why had their likeness been preserved when so much else was discarded? Local historians were the first to take notice. The names penciled faintly on the back: Thomas Whitlock, Eleanor Gray, Elias Whitlock belonged to a family once prominent in the county, though their fortunes had long collapsed. At first, the picture seemed no more than a curiosity, a scrap of genealogical record. Yet when it was shown to those who remembered the whispers about Hollow Creek, unease deepened. The portrait, they said, revealed more than it should have. It was not a family united in celebration, but one fractured in the very moment meant to symbolize union. Photographs are often called evidence of truth, the machine's impartial record of what once was. But sometimes, truth resists silence. Sometimes it seeps into the frame, into the nervous smile, the averted glance, the gaze that lingers too long. This image, pulled from obscurity, was less a keepsake than a warning, a frozen testament to a story no one at that wedding dared to speak aloud. The house rose out of the earth like something half-remembered, its columns streaked with lichen, its shutters sagging as though too heavy to keep open. Hollow Creek Manor had once been the pride of the Whitlock family, a statement of power carved into the southern landscape in the years after the Civil War. Local histories recorded its construction in exacting detail: the imported marble for the fireplace mantels, the grand oak doors hewn from timber on the family's own land, the wrought iron balconies that curled like vines around the second floor. To those who first saw it, the house was not simply a residence, but a fortress of ambition, a declaration that the Whitlocks would endure when other fortunes crumbled. The land around it told a more complicated story. Hollow Creek wound its way through the property, slow and murky, its waters often swollen with silt after spring rains. Cotton fields once stretched wide across the estate, but by the late 19th century, they bore more weeds than profit. Tenant farmers worked the soil for a fraction of its yield, their lives bound to the same earth that no longer gave generously. Yet within the walls of the manor, the illusion of grandeur persisted. Chandeliers still glowed at night, dinners stretched for hours beneath portraits of ancestors who glared down with fixed authority. Travelers spoke of the house with a mixture of admiration and unease. From a distance, it looked noble, almost picturesque, framed by oak trees and approached by a long gravel drive. But closer inspection revealed cracks in its symmetry. Windows clouded with dust, a roofline that sagged just enough to suggest neglect, a faint smell of damp rising from the cellar. Those who worked the land whispered that the house was cursed, though few could agree on what form the curse took. Some said the soil itself rejected the family's arrogance, others that the waters of Hollow Creek carried something darker, a kind of restless spirit that moved between its banks and the halls of the manor. By the 1870s, when the infamous wedding portrait was taken, Hollow Creek Manor had already begun its decline. The Whitlocks held on to their stature with iron fists, but the wealth that had built the house was waning. Guests who attended gatherings there often left unsettled, not by the food or the music, but by the atmosphere itself. The rooms felt heavy, the air thick with something unspoken. Children of the county dared each other to approach the gates at dusk, swearing they heard voices where no one stood. To the outside world, Hollow Creek was still a house of standing, a symbol of heritage and endurance, but to those who knew its history or claimed to the manor, had become something else entirely. It was a stage for secrets, a place where walls absorbed more than laughter, where sins were not confessed but preserved, sealed into the timber and stone. The house, they said, remembered everything, and in time it would reveal what had been buried within its walls. The Whitlocks traced their lineage back to the first settlers who pressed into the county's red clay soil, men who carved out farms with musket and plow and claimed dominion over everything their eyes could hold. By the time Hollow Creek Manor rose against the horizon, the family had already woven itself into the county's history, their name etched into land deeds, courthouse ledgers, and church plaques. They were not the wealthiest clan, nor the most numerous, but they carried themselves as though destiny itself had marked them for permanence. Every decision, every alliance, every marriage was measured not in affection but in advantage, each choice bending toward the preservation of the Whitlock name. At the center of this long arc stood Elias Whitlock, the patriarch whose shadow stretched across both kin and soil. Born just after the Civil War, he inherited land battered but not broken, and through relentless will he made it profitable again. Neighbors described him as a man who did not smile often, but when he did, it carried more weight than laughter. His judgments were absolute. What he declared at the dinner table became law in the fields the next morning. Farmhands knew better than to test his patience, and his children learned quickly that obedience was expected, not negotiated. Elias believed the Whitlocks survived because they did not bend. He wore tradition like armor, invoking scripture when he disciplined his children and family history when he chastised his workers. To him, the world was a ladder, and the Whitlocks had climbed too high to look down. That philosophy hardened into a family creed, one that kept them proud but also isolated. Where others forged friendships in town, the Whitlocks kept to themselves, their social circle confined to those Elias deemed acceptable. The family tree under his command grew crooked. Thomas, his only son, was raised less as a child than as an heir, his life mapped before he could choose it. The daughters were bartered in marriage to strengthen ties with landowners and merchants, their desires quieted beneath Elias's vision of legacy. His wife, a woman remembered more for her silence than her speech, faded into the background, a presence noted only in church pews and household routines. Yet even as Elias tightened his grip, cracks appeared. His authority bred resentment, his rigidity left no space for tenderness. Neighbors gossiped that the Whitlocks' grandeur was hollow, that behind the polished shutters lay a family bound by fear rather than affection. The patriarch's word may have ruled the fields and the house alike, but in the silence it imposed, something darker began to take root. The Whitlocks, for all their reputation, were not immune to the forces that undo even the strongest dynasties. Their iron legacy, so carefully forged, would in time corrode from within. Thomas Whitlock was born into duty rather than freedom, the only son of Elias Whitlock and the vessel through which the family's future was meant to endure. From his earliest days he was trained in the rhythms of the estate, the tallying of harvests, the negotiation of debts, the stern manner of command that his father believed was the very marrow of manhood. Yet those who knew Thomas in his youth spoke of a gentler temperament, a boy who lingered at the creek instead of the counting house, who read novels in secret when his father demanded scripture. His inheritance was never in question, but the shape of his life was carved long before he could bend it to his own will. By the mid-1870s, with Hollow Creek Manor still clinging to its stature, Alias decreed it time for Thomas to marry. The choice of bride was as calculated as any ledger entry, yet in Eleanor Gray, the match seemed blessed by both practicality and beauty. Eleanor came from a respected family in the neighboring county, her father, a lawyer of good standing, and her mother noted for refinement. More than that, Eleanor herself carried a kind of radiance that drew notice wherever she walked. Her hair was pale against the dark fabrics of mourning still worn in those post-war years, her eyes clear in a way that unsettled as much as it charmed. To the townspeople, she was the kind of woman who could elevate the Whitlocks, binding their name to a new generation with both dignity and allure. The wedding in 1876 was a spectacle by local standards. Guests arrived in carriages, their wheels crunching over the gravel drive, while inside the manor the chandeliers blazed with gaslight. The ceremony was held beneath the broad oak that shadowed the front lawn, the minister's words drifting across the summer air. Thomas stood straight, his face betraying nerves that no instruction had trained away. Eleanor appeared calm, though those who remembered the day later remarked that her gaze seldom met her groom's. Instead, it often dropped to the earth or flicked sideways, as though wary of eyes upon her. Those eyes belonged to Elias. He presided not as father of the groom but as master of the house, his presence dominating the gathering. When the vows were spoken and the kiss exchanged, witnesses recalled that Elias clapped Thomas on the back with little warmth, his expression fixed on the new bride as though she were the true acquisition of the day. Eleanor's hand trembled in her glove, though she smiled as required. That evening the guests dined in the long hall of Hollow Creek, their toasts echoing against high ceilings, while the couple sat side by side at the table's head. Yet even amid the laughter and music, a heaviness lingered, difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The union of Thomas and Eleanor was meant to secure the Whitlock line, but to those with sharper eyes it seemed already shadowed by something unspoken. The heir had gained his bride, but the marriage carried with it a silence that no celebration could dispel. From the moment Elias Whitlock entered a room, conversation shifted. Men straightened their posture, women lowered their voices, and children shrank into the edges of the crowd. He had built his authority over decades, brick by brick, until it was no longer confined to his estate but seeped into the county itself. His reputation was carved in equal measure from fear and respect. To some, he was a man of vision, holding together a fortune that should have dissolved after the war. To others, he was a tyrant whose sternness left no room for kindness. Whatever they believed, none denied his presence. It was iron, and it pressed upon all who came near. At his son's wedding in the summer of 1876, that presence eclipsed the ceremony itself. Guests who gathered on the lawn beneath the oak tree spoke later not of the bride's gown or the nervous groom, but of the way Elias carried himself. He stood slightly behind Thomas and Eleanor, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture more commanding than celebratory. His expression revealed little, but his eyes betrayed him. They did not rest on his son, the heir for whom he had built his every ambition. Instead, they lingered on the bride, watching her with a scrutiny that unsettled even those accustomed to his severity. Eleanor felt it most keenly. She smiled as duty demanded, her veil catching the afternoon light, but her gaze drifted downward, away from the crowd, away from the man who was supposed to be her husband, as though seeking shelter from a stare she dared not return. A bridesmaid recalled later how Eleanor's hand trembled when Elias approached to offer a toast, his words polished but his eyes fixed where they should not have been. The unease spread quietly through the guests like a draught. One whispered to another, and by the time the feast began inside the manor, More than one guest had remarked that Elias Whitlock watched his new daughter-in-law too closely. The rumors that followed did not explode but simmered. Neighbors who had long tolerated Elias's severity now spoke in hushed tones about impropriety. Some suggested it was nothing more than a misinterpretation, the stern watchfulness of a father measuring the worth of the woman who would carry his line. Others, less charitable, muttered that Elias's gaze was not paternal at all, but hungry, and that Eleanor's avoidance was not shyness but dread. Whatever the truth, the wedding day revealed a fracture invisible to most, but keenly felt by those within the house. Thomas, pale and anxious, tried to ignore the tension. Eleanor, bound now to both son and father, carried the weight of eyes that would not release her. And Elias, towering at the head of the table, seemed less the guardian of his family's future than a shadow cast too long, darkening what should have been a beginning. The first of Eleanor's letters surfaced decades later, folded carefully inside a family Bible sold at auction. Written in a delicate hand, the ink browned with age, they seemed at first like ordinary correspondence between a new bride and her childhood confidant. Yet the more closely one read, the more troubling the words became. She described life at Hollow Creek Manor not as the blissful beginning expected of marriage, but as something closer to confinement. "The walls feel too near," she wrote in one passage. "Though the rooms are large enough to swallow me whole, I do not move unseen. His eyes follow even when his feet do not." The his required no explanation. Every line seemed to circle back to her father-in-law. In another letter she confessed that she rarely lingered in the garden anymore. What should have been a place of comfort, filled with roses and shaded by oaks, had become a stage where she felt observed. Elias had a way of appearing without warning, standing just beyond the hedgerows, his cane pressed into the soil, his gaze fixed on her as though studying some fragile object. "I feel as if I am an exhibit, not a wife," she told her friend. "And though Thomas is near, it is not he who fills the air about me." The unease carried into the house itself. Eleanor recounted evenings when she sat in the parlor with her embroidery, Thomas reading nearby, only to look up and find Elias in the doorway, silent, watching. He did not speak, did not enter, only lingered long enough to make her fingers falter on the thread. At night she imagined his footsteps outside her chamber, slow along the hall, as though measuring the distance between them. "There are moments," she admitted, in a letter never meant for outside eyes, "when I cannot tell if I am wife or captive. The vows I took were for Thomas, but I live beneath another man's rule." Neighbors who visited Hollow Creek in those first months after the wedding remembered Eleanor's politeness, her careful smile, but some sensed the strain beneath it. She was thinner than on her wedding day, her voice softer, her laughter quick to vanish. When asked if she was well, she deflected with practiced grace, speaking instead of the weather or the roses that refused to bloom. Her letters reveal the truth she could not speak aloud, a constant pressure, invisible but suffocating, that twisted even ordinary hours into unease. She was not merely the bride of Thomas Whitlock. She was the object of Elias's attention, a gaze that turned every corner of Hollow Creek into a place of watchfulness. What began as whispers among guests had become her daily reality, each day thick with the weight of eyes she could neither escape nor confront. Marriage should have marked a beginning for Thomas and Eleanor, a step into independence where they might carve out a household of their own. But Elias Whitlock had no intention of releasing his son from the shadow of Hollow Creek Manor. Tradition, he insisted, demanded continuity. The heir and his bride were to remain under his roof, learning to manage the estate not as equals, but as subordinates. To defy him would have been unthinkable, and so Thomas and Eleanor settled not into a home of their choosing, but into the great house already thick with his presence. From the start, the arrangement bred unease. Eleanor had imagined evenings with her husband in quiet rooms, the space to learn each other's rhythms, the privacy to grow into the marriage that duty had forged. Instead, every hallway, every parlor, every meal was shared with Elias. At the long dining table, Thomas sat at one end. Eleanor beside him, yet Elias presided over them both, his voice dominating conversation, his decisions dictating the hours of their days. Even their bedchamber, tucked away on the manor's second floor, seemed less sanctuary than concession, for Elias roamed the halls late at night, and the creak of his footsteps often woke Eleanor from uneasy sleep. For Thomas, the burden was doubled. He had long endured his father's severity, but as husband, he was torn between loyalty to his bride and obedience to the man who still controlled his inheritance. Elias expected him to mimic his ways, to discipline the farmhands with the same severity, to treat Eleanor not as partner but as adornment. Thomas hesitated, his gentler instincts clashing with the model of authority imposed upon him. His hesitation only deepened Eleanor's isolation, for she saw in him not a protector but a man trapped, unable or unwilling to stand against his father. The servants, too, felt the strain. They whispered of sharp exchanges between father and son, of Eleanor's tears glimpsed through half-open doors, of rooms gone silent the moment Elias entered. Hollow Creek, once a house of grandeur, had become a crucible of unspoken conflict. Affection shrank in its corridors. Laughter was rare. Each meal, each gathering, carried the weight of Elias's will pressing down upon the household. Neighbors who called on the newlyweds left with the sense that the Whitlocks were less a family than a hierarchy. What should have been a home for two had become a stage for three, and the imbalance was unmistakable. Instead of freedom, the young couple found themselves bound tighter than before, caught in a household where the past refused to release its grip, and where the father's shadow reached even into the spaces meant for love. It began with small disturbances, the kind easily dismissed as coincidence but difficult to forget once noticed. Servants whispered first, in the kitchen, and along the back staircases where their words would not carry. Doors that had been firmly latched were found ajar without a hand near them. Windows, secured at dusk, stood open by morning, their curtains drifting, though no one claimed to have touched them. In a house as old as Hollow Creek Manor, such things could be blamed on drafts, on warped wood and settling stone, yet the pattern soon became too precise to ignore. The stories always seemed to circle back to Elias and Eleanor. Candles that burned steady all evening would sputter into shadows the moment Elias entered a room where she, Saturday. A fire that roared in the hearth for hours would suddenly collapse into smoke when he crossed the threshold. Some claimed they had seen Eleanor flinch at these moments, as though she felt the same shift in the air, a heaviness that followed him like a cloak. One maid insisted that she once passed by the drawing room and heard Elias speaking in a low voice, though no reply came. When she dared glance through the crack in the door, Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, eyes fixed on her lap, while the candlelight dimmed until it looked ready to die. The gossip spread beyond the servants' hall. Field hands reported accidents too strange to be dismissed, a mule collapsing in the traces without cause, tools slipping from steady hands as though tugged by some unseen force. They said the land itself was turning against the Whitlocks, rejecting whatever had taken root inside the manor walls. At church, when the Whitlock family appeared in their pew, hymns seemed to falter, voices growing thin as parishioners glanced at Eleanor, pale and withdrawn, her father-in-law looming beside her. Neighbors began to call the happenings a curse. Some claimed it had been summoned by Elias's sins, that his desire for what was forbidden had stained the household. Others whispered of older roots, that Hollow Creek itself carried something restless, and Elias's fixation on his son's bride had merely awakened it. Whatever the explanation, the unease was real enough to shape how people moved around the family. Invitations to the manor grew fewer. Visitors shortened their calls, leaving before dusk when the house seemed most unsettled. Inside, the tension deepened. Eleanor's letters grew darker, describing sleepless nights broken by sudden drafts, by footsteps in hallways that led nowhere. Thomas tried to comfort her, but even he admitted in private that the house no longer felt the same. "The walls listen," he said once to a trusted friend, a phrase that would be remembered long after his disappearance. By then, the rumors had taken hold. Hollow Creek was not merely a grand estate in decline. It was a place marked by something unnatural, a curse born from a father's shadow and a bride's unspoken fear. Thomas Whitlock had always lived under his father's shadow, and for much of his youth he accepted it as the natural order. Alias commanded, and Thomas obeyed. It was the way of the estate, the rhythm of the household. But after his marriage, the weight of that shadow grew unbearable, no longer pressing solely on him, but on Eleanor as well. He began to notice things he could not ignore, gestures and glances that seemed ordinary in the moment, but settled heavily in memory afterward. His father's hand lingering too long on the back of Eleanor's chair, the way conversations paused when Elias entered a room, and, most telling of all, Eleanor's quickening breath whenever those footsteps echoed down the hall. At first, Thomas convinced himself he was imagining it. He wanted desperately to believe that his father's presence was merely stern, paternal oversight, not something darker. Yet night after night, as Eleanor grew quieter, her laughter vanishing into silence, he began to see the truth in her eyes. She never spoke directly of her fear, but her hands betrayed her. She fumbled with her embroidery, her fingers trembling when Elias entered the room. At dinner she picked at her food, her gaze lowered to her plate as if afraid to meet anyone's eyes. When Thomas tried to ask her what troubled her, she only shook her head, whispering that she was tired. The realization crept upon him slowly, cruelly. He saw how little freedom they truly had within Hollow Creek Manor. Every decision, from the management of the fields to the time of their meals, was dictated by Elias. Even their private chambers felt invaded, for Elias roamed the corridors at night, his cane tapping on the wooden floors, a sound that made Eleanor shiver beneath the covers. Thomas lay awake listening, torn between the urge to rise and bar the door, and the deeper fear of what confrontation might bring. To speak against Elias was to challenge not just a father but a ruler. Thomas had watched his sisters silenced by marriage contracts, and his mother disappear into submission. He knew the futility of resistance. Yet he also knew that his bride was fading before his eyes, her spirit dimming in the very place that should have been her refuge. The conflict gnawed at him. Loyalty to the man who had shaped his life against the duty he now owed to the woman he had sworn to protect. Neighbors remarked later that Thomas seemed strained in those months. His face drawn, his manner distracted. He rode out often alone, circling the fields as if searching for answers in the land itself. But when he returned, nothing changed. Elias still dominated every corner of the house, and Eleanor still withdrew further into silence. To confront his father outright was unthinkable, yet to remain passive was a betrayal that ate at him. Trapped between obedience and defiance, Thomas began to feel as though he were living in a house already doomed, one where the walls pressed closer with each passing day, and where his own hesitation was as destructive as the shadow looming over them. The discovery came years after the family had crumbled, when the manor stood empty and its upper rooms were left to dust. In a corner of the attic, beneath a stack of moth-eaten linens and brittle newspapers, a small leather-bound book was found. Its pages were warped with damp, its cover cracked, but the ink inside remained legible. It was Eleanor's hand, unmistakable in its delicate slope, and within it she had preserved what she could never speak aloud. The diary began innocently enough, with passages about the wedding, the garden, and the endless obligations of a new mistress of the house. But quickly, the tone shifted. "The halls breathe," she wrote, and not in the manner of a home creaking with age, but as though the walls themselves are alive, tightening when he enters, loosening when he leaves. She never named Elias directly in those early entries, but his presence hung over every line. Thomas appeared rarely in her words, often described with kindness but also distance, as though he were fading from her world even as he sat beside her each evening. It was Elias who filled the space, not by affection, but by weight. Her dread sharpened in later pages. "The house conspires," she confessed in one entry. "I feel it pressing me toward him, not as wife to husband, but as something claimed by another." She described doors that opened when she passed, as if ushering her into rooms where Elias waited. She wrote of dreams in which she stood at the top of the staircase while Elias reached for her hand, and no matter how fiercely she tried to pull away, the house seemed to tilt her forward. I am not his daughter, not his ward, yet the walls declare otherwise. They will not release me. There were nights when she wrote of fleeing, of running barefoot into the fields and vanishing beyond the creek. Yet every attempt ended in paralysis. The windows look outward but promise no escape, she recorded. The moment I press my hand to the glass, I feel as though he stands behind me, watching, waiting. In the margins she scrawled prayers half erased, pleas that God might soften the hold Elias had upon her. But even those words trailed into despair. The most chilling passage lay near the end. I fear I shall not belong to Thomas at all. The vows spoken before the oak were a curtain, but behind it, another bond was fastened. It is not of love, nor of God. It is of this house, and of him who built it. To read those words now is to feel the suffocation she endured, not only from Elias's shadow but from the manor itself. As if stone and timber had become accomplices in her captivity. What began as a bride's unease had hardened into certainty. She was bound, not to her husband, but to the father who refused to let go. The storm had been gathering all afternoon, the kind that made the windows rattle in their frames and sent the servants to bolt shutters against the wind. By evening, Hollow Creek Manor seemed to tremble beneath the weight of thunder. Rain poured in sheets against the glass, the corridors echoing with the uneven rhythm of water finding cracks in the roof. It was on such a night, when the house felt most alive, that Thomas climbed the stairs and found his father where he should never have been. Eleanor's chamber glowed faintly with candlelight, its door not fully latched. Thomas pushed it open, expecting to find his wife alone. Instead, Elias stood near the bed, his cane resting against the wall, his figure too close to Eleanor, who sat rigid on the edge of the mattress. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the floor, and she did not look up when Thomas entered. The silence in the room was unbearable, louder even than the storm outside. What passed between them in that instant was never fully recorded. Some later claimed Thomas cried out in rage, accusing his father of violating the sanctity of his household. Others said he spoke barely a word, that the fury on his face was enough to fill the chamber. Elias, always the master of his own composure, did not retreat. He met his son's eyes with a coldness that suggested defiance rather than shame. Whether his presence in that room was born of intent or some twisted accident mattered little. The image of it, the patriarch looming where only the husband belonged, could never be erased. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. Her body caught between both men as though the very storm outside had drawn itself into the room. She whispered Thomas's name once, soft and broken, but it carried no resolution. For Thomas, the betrayal was not only in his father's intrusion, but in Eleanor's silence. Did she fear Elias so completely that she could not cry out? Or had the house itself conditioned her into a stillness that made resistance impossible? What followed was chaos. The servants heard shouting, the crash of something heavy overturned, the violent slam of a door. Some said Thomas struck his father. Others insisted Elias's voice, booming with fury, drowned out all else. When the noise subsided, the house held its breath. Elias emerged into the corridor moments later, his expression fixed, his cane tapping steadily against the floor. Thomas did not appear until much later, his face shadowed, his jaw set as though carved in stone. Eleanor remained behind her door, weeping quietly into the storm. From that night onward, the household was never the same. Meals were taken in silence, the servants moved cautiously as though through a battlefield, and the marriage that had once promised continuity was fractured beyond repair. The confrontation had shattered the fragile order of Hollow Creek. Father, son, and bride now lived beneath one roof in a tension that could not last, each bound to the others by dread and by blood, waiting for the final break. The disappearance came quietly, without spectacle, though its echo would haunt the county for generations. Only 3 days had passed since the storm and the confrontation in Eleanor's chamber, and the manor had not yet settled from its rupture. Thomas moved through the halls like a man half-possessed, his footsteps heavy, his words clipped, his gaze fixed on some private torment. The servants avoided him, sensing that even the smallest intrusion might provoke a flare of anger. Eleanor, pale and withdrawn, kept to her rooms, emerging only for meals, where she spoke almost nothing. Elias carried on as though nothing had transpired, his voice measured, his authority unchanged, though his eyes betrayed a vigilance sharper than before. On the morning of his disappearance, Thomas was seen saddling his horse in the gray light before dawn. One servant swore he overheard him muttering beneath his breath, something about finding answers or ending this, though the words were obscured by the clatter of hooves on the stones. He carried no provisions, no rifle, no change of clothes, only the clothes on his back and a small satchel slung across his shoulder. Eleanor had not risen from bed, and if he intended to leave her any explanation, none was ever found. By evening, when the horse had not returned and no rider was seen on the roads, concern began to ripple through the household. Elias ordered search parties into the fields and along the creek, though whether out of paternal worry or to preserve appearances, no one could say. Lanterns bobbed through the woods, men called out into the darkness, but the land gave back no answer. Days stretched into weeks, and still there was nothing, no body, no tracks, no sign of struggle. It was as if Thomas had dissolved into the very soil. The county clerk's ledger recorded the disappearance in a single stark line: Thomas Whitlock, last seen riding east from Hollow Creek Manor, presumed missing. Church registers echoed the same. But among neighbors and servants, explanations multiplied. Some believed he had fled, unable to endure the weight of his father's shadow and the unspoken scandal with Eleanor. Others whispered he had been silenced, that Elias himself had seen to it that no rival for authority remained. Still others claimed the curse of the manor had claimed its first life, the creek pulling him under, the woods swallowing him whole. For Eleanor, the loss was a hollowing. She wore black, though no grave was dug, drifting through the manor like a widow without a body to mourn. Elias forbade speculation, insisting the matter was closed, yet even he seemed altered, his shoulders stooped, his cane striking the floor with greater force, as though to remind the house who remained master. Thomas had vanished, but the silence he left behind was louder than thunder. It wrapped itself around Hollow Creek, tightening the walls, deepening the unease, and leaving the question that no one dared ask aloud. Had the heir escaped, or had he been consumed? After Thomas's disappearance, Hollow Creek Manor seemed to close in on itself, its windows darkening earlier, its rooms growing colder even in summer. The heir was gone, and with him any shield Eleanor might have hoped for. She remained in the house, not as a wife now, but as something between widow and prisoner. Servants whispered that she seldom spoke, that her meals went untouched, that the sound of her footsteps could be heard long after midnight as she drifted through the corridors. To see her by lamplight was to see a figure half-faded, her gown loose against her frame, her eyes ringed with shadows. The household adjusted to her presence as though to a ghost. Maids avoided meeting her gaze, and farmhands crossing the yard at night reported seeing her silhouette framed in the windows, unmoving for hours. One claimed that he passed beneath the east wing and heard her whispering, though no second voice replied. Another swore that she rattled the door handles as if testing whether she could escape. The stories grew darker with each retelling, until neighbors began to say outright that Elias had locked her away, keeping her not as a daughter-in-law but as a possession. If Elias heard these rumors, he did not answer them. He carried himself with the same unyielding authority as always, appearing at church on Sundays, presiding over the estate with cold precision. Yet even he seemed altered when it came to Eleanor. He insisted she remain within the manor, rarely allowing her carriage into town, and when visitors came, she was conspicuously absent. Once or twice, a neighbor glimpsed her on the veranda, her pale hand resting on the railing, her lips parted as if she might cry out. But Elias was always near, his cane striking the floorboards, his figure cutting off any chance of approach. In her solitude, Eleanor became part of the house itself. The servants said the halls grew colder where she walked, that candles flickered low when she entered. Some believed she had stopped resisting, her will bent entirely to Elias's control. Others insisted she was planning escape, moving silently at night to learn the rhythms of the household, waiting for the moment when she could slip free. Yet weeks became months, and she remained. By then, Hollow Creek was shunned by most of the county. Families who had once attended dinners or weddings refused invitations. Passing travelers avoided the estate after dusk, claiming they saw a pale woman in the windows who vanished when approached. Eleanor, once celebrated as a bride, was now a figure of dread, a silent presence drifting through a house that seemed more like a prison with each passing season. Bound by absence, by rumor, and by the iron will of her father-in-law, she was no longer simply the mistress of Hollow Creek. She was its captive, her life consumed by the shadow that had devoured her husband before her. It began with the animals. A cow, strong and healthy the evening before, was found stiff and lifeless in the pasture by dawn, its eyes wide as though startled at the moment of death. A prized horse stumbled in the stable and broke its leg without cause, forcing the men to put it down. Chickens stopped laying, their nests barren despite careful tending. The servants tried to reason it away. Disease, bad feed, the natural turns of misfortune, but the pattern grew too strange to ignore. Healthy livestock perished overnight. Tools slipped from steady hands and split open feet. Wagons overturned on level ground. The ordinary workings of the estate became punctuated by calamity. The farmhands were the first to whisper the word curse. They had long spoken among themselves of the strange heaviness in the manor, of the bride who drifted silently through the halls, of the master whose eyes lingered where they should not. Now they claimed the land itself was striking back. God's hand has fallen on Hollow Creek, one declared after a plow blade snapped clean in two, though the soil was soft. Another refused to return after finding the carcass of a sheep tangled in a fence, its wool singed as if by unseen fire. The whispers spread beyond the estate, carried into town by merchants and laborers who had no desire to linger on Whitlock land. Neighbors who once tolerated Elias's severity began to avoid him altogether. Church pews that had always made room for the Whitlocks now shifted coldly aside. Sermons turned sharper, ministers warning against the wages of hidden sin. Some said openly that the tragedies on the estate were judgment, punishment for Elias's pride and his unnatural hold on the young woman trapped in his house. At the market, when Hollow Creek servants appeared to buy supplies, silence often followed them, as though others feared the curse might cling to their very clothes. Within the manor, fear thickened. Servants prayed more often, their crosses clutched tight, their eyes darting toward every shadow. Some fled, abandoning their posts under cover of night, unwilling to work in a place where accidents seemed less like chance and more like consequence. Eleanor, pale and withdrawn, grew thinner still, her presence now associated with the failing of lamps, the shudder of windows, the sudden collapse of crops. Whether she was victim or vessel, no one could decide. Elias dismissed it all as cowardice, but even his voice could not silence the unease. His cane struck harder against the floors, his commands grew harsher, as though volume alone could drown out the rumors. But beyond the gates of Hollow Creek, the story had already taken root. The Whitlocks were marked, their house a place of judgment, and their land cursed. Each new death in the fields and each new whisper in town only deepened the certainty that the shadow consuming the family had spread to the soil itself. Time, which Elias Whitlock once seemed to command as firmly as he did his household, began to erode him in plain sight. His shoulders stooped, his stride slowed, and the hand that gripped his cane trembled with age. Yet even as his body weakened, his hold on the manor and its lone inhabitant only tightened. He prowled the corridors long after midnight, his candle throwing a feeble glow that deepened the shadows rather than dispelled them. Servants whispered that he had become more specter than master, a gaunt figure whose obsession with control outlived his strength. The estate reflected his decline. The cotton fields, once his pride, yielded less each season. Debts mounted as neighboring farms adopted new methods and machinery, while Hollow Creek clung to the old ways Elias refused to abandon. The great halls that had once hosted lavish dinners now stood empty, their chandeliers unlit, their long tables dust-covered. Even the livestock grew fewer, their deaths still whispered of as part of the curse that had spread through the land. What wealth remained was siphoned away to pay creditors, leaving the Whitlocks diminished in both fortune and standing. Scandal gnawed at his reputation. The whispers that had begun with Eleanor's unease now swelled into something larger, a county-wide suspicion that Elias had crossed a line no man should. Thomas's disappearance lingered like an open wound, and though no proof ever surfaced, most believed Elias bore the stain of it. Rumors claimed he had silenced his son to remove a rival, that he kept Eleanor as something more than a daughter-in-law, that the accidents on the farm were not accidents at all but the toll of divine wrath. By the 1880s, the Whitlock name, once invoked with deference, had become shorthand for disgrace. Elias responded as he always had, with denial and fury. He struck his cane harder into the floors, barked orders with a voice that cracked more often than it boomed, and punished servants for the smallest of mistakes. But authority born of fear cannot survive when fear turns to contempt. One by one, those who had worked his land slipped away, finding employment elsewhere, leaving the manor eerily vacant. The fewer who remained obeyed out of pity more than loyalty, serving a man who had become a relic, snarling against a world that no longer listened. Yet even in his frailty, Elias refused to release his grip on Eleanor. Visitors who caught a rare glimpse of her noted that she seemed paler than ever, her movements rehearsed, as though she had been conditioned into silence. Elias appeared beside her unfailingly, his skeletal frame casting a shadow that still carried menace. In those final years, Hollow Creek was less a home than a mausoleum, with Elias clinging to the ruins of his power, his obsession undimmed even as everything else, wealth, respect, health, rotted away around him. When Elias Whitlock finally succumbed to age, it was not with the grandeur of a patriarch but with the frailty of a man clinging to shadows. His body was laid in the family plot beneath the oak, the same tree that had witnessed his son's wedding years before. Few attended the burial. The neighbors who once would have gathered in reverence stayed away, their absence a silent judgment on the man whose reputation had long since collapsed. Only a handful of servants, weary from years of dwindling wages and whispered rumors, stood by the grave. Eleanor was there too, veiled and pale, her face unreadable as the soil fell upon the coffin. If she mourned, she did so without tears. With Elias gone, the estate passed to her. On paper, she became mistress of Hollow Creek, owner of its land, its debts, and its fading name. Yet in truth, the inheritance was more burden than blessing. The fields lay fallow, the house sagged with neglect, and creditors pressed at the gates. Still, Eleanor remained, walking the halls that had caged her for decades, her footsteps solitary in rooms once crowded with command. Some expected her to remarry, to secure stability with a new husband who might restore her fortunes. But no such union came. She withdrew instead into silence, her life defined not by renewal, but by endurance. Most striking was her refusal to ever speak of Thomas. His name, once the promise of the Whitlock line, vanished from her lips as if it had been erased. Visitors who dared inquire were met with a blankness, a polite change of subject, or a quiet departure from the room. Even in her letters, fragments of which survived, he was absent. To some, her silence suggested grief too deep to voice. To others, it was fear, as though naming him might awaken the darkness that had swallowed him. Whatever the truth, Thomas Whitlock became a ghost, not just in body but in memory, banished from the story of the house that should have been his. In the years that followed, Eleanor became a figure of curiosity. Locals spoke of glimpsing her on the manor's veranda at dusk, her black dress trailing behind her, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though waiting for something that never arrived. Children dared one another to creep up to the gates and call her name, swearing they saw her silhouette in the window, unmoving as stone. She was neither feared nor admired, but pitied, a widow without a husband, a mistress without power, a woman bound to silence. She lived on this way until her own death, her story unfinished, her secrets unspoken. And when at last she was laid to rest beside the man who had dominated her life, the silence she had carried became her legacy. Hollow Creek remained, ruined and abandoned, its walls holding what she never revealed. The woman who had outlived both husband and father-in-law left behind no children, no heirs, no testimony, only the unsettling quiet of a life endured, never explained. Long after the Whitlocks were gone and Hollow Creek Manor stood in ruin, the people of the county kept the story alive in whispers. Around hearths in winter and on porches in summer, neighbors passed down fragments of memory, shaping them into something larger than fact. They said that on certain nights, when the moon was sharp and the air heavy, cries could be heard from the direction of the manor. Not the shouts of quarrels or the cries of children, but the high, keening wail of a woman, echoing across the fields. Those who swore they heard it described the sound as more sorrow than terror, the voice of someone mourning endlessly for what had been taken. Others insisted the screams belonged not to grief but to rage, a haunting reminder of a bride trapped in a house that never released her. The most enduring tales centered on the creek itself. That slow, murky water had long been the boundary of the Whitlock land, its currents too shallow for fishing, too restless for swimming. It was near this creek, locals believed, that Thomas Whitlock had disappeared, riding east and never returning. Afterward, people spoke of seeing a figure along its banks, a woman in white, her dress glowing pale in the starlight. She was said to move without sound, her head bowed, her hands brushing the water's surface as though searching for something lost beneath. Farmers returning late from market claimed the figure vanished if approached, dissolving into mist just as the air grew cold. Children dared one another to visit the creek at night, and those who went swore they felt watched, their lanterns sputtering out before they reached the water. Older residents told the stories with a kind of grim certainty, convinced the apparition was Eleanor. Some said she searched for her husband, doomed to wander until she found him. Others argued she was bound not by love but by despair, cursed to repeat her own captivity along the creek that marked her prison. A few even claimed the figure was not Eleanor at all, but the spirit of the house itself, wearing her likeness as it carried its secrets into eternity. What made the stories endure was the consistency of their details. Generations apart, people described the same vision, the same cries, the same sudden chill in the air. Whether ghost, memory, or invention, the figure at Hollow Creek became part of the land's identity. Travelers avoided the estate after dark, and even in daylight the ruins seemed uneasy, as though holding on to the sorrow that neighbors had long since woven into legend. The Whitlocks were gone, but their curse remained, etched not in stone or ink, but in the voices of those who remembered. The Whitlock family Bible surfaced not in the manor itself, but in the county archives decades after the house had fallen to ruin. It had been catalogued among a box of legal papers, its leather binding cracked, the brass clasp rusted nearly shut. At first glance it was no different from countless other family registers of the time, scripture on thick paper, births and deaths neatly recorded in careful script. Yet the closer archivists looked, the more troubling it became. The genealogical section, where families usually took the greatest pride, was in disarray. Whole pages had been torn out, leaving only jagged stubs. Names were crossed through with heavy ink, their letters gouged so deeply that the paper nearly split. What should have been a record of lineage was instead a battlefield of erasures. The earliest generations were intact, Whitlock forebears traced back to the first settlers who carved farms out of the wilderness. But by the mid-19th century, the record grew chaotic. The birth of Thomas was noted, his name written with steady hand, but beside it, a thick slash of ink rendered it nearly illegible. Eleanor's name appeared only once, added in a lighter hand, then scraped nearly clean from the page. Most haunting of all was the blank space where the marriages should have been listed. The line that ought to have united Thomas and Eleanor had been cut away entirely, as though someone had decided the union must not exist even on paper. Historians puzzled over who might have done it. Some argued it was Elias himself, determined to control not only the present, but the record of the past, blotting out his son in the same way he had dominated him in life. Others believed it was Eleanor, left alone after Elias's death, destroying the entries in a desperate attempt to reclaim her own story. Still others suggested it was later descendants, embarrassed by the scandal that clung to the family, trying to sever themselves from a legacy too stained to preserve. But the effect of the mutilated Bible was undeniable. Where families normally used such records to preserve continuity, the Whitlocks version seemed to conspire in forgetting. The missing pages carried as much weight as the words that remained. Visitors who studied it in the archives described a sensation of unease, as if the silence of those blank spaces spoke louder than ink. It was as though history itself recoiled from the Whitlocks, refusing to bear witness to their unraveling. The Bible should have been a testament to permanence, a reassurance that names endure even when bodies decay. Instead, it was a monument to erasure. The Whitlocks had sought to bind themselves to land, to power, to legacy. Yet even their own record betrayed them, leaving behind a family tree riddled with scars, where memory collapsed into absence and the truth of their story slipped into shadow. Beyond the overgrown orchards and the crumbling stone walls of Hollow Creek Manor, where the land dips toward the creek's bend, there lies a patch of earth set apart from the family plot. No headstone marks it. No inscription bears a name. Only a shallow mound now covered by grass and the gnarled roots of a leaning oak. Locals call it the Forgotten Grave, and for more than a century it has been the subject of endless speculation. Some say it belongs to Thomas Whitlock, the heir who vanished without a trace. Others whisper it is Eleanor who lies there, buried in secrecy far from the family that had consumed her life. Still others insist the grave belongs to neither, but to a secret no one dared write down. Children in the county grew up with dares tied to that spot. They would steal away at dusk, lanterns swinging nervously, to touch the mound and declare which soul they believed it held. Those who returned swore the ground felt colder than the rest of the field, even on the warmest summer evenings. They said the oak above it creaked without wind, its branches groaning like a mourner in the dark. One boy claimed he saw the outline of a woman kneeling at the grave, her dress pale in the moonlight, though when he blinked she was gone. Theories multiplied with each generation. Supporters of the Thomas story argued that Elias, in his fury, may have silenced his son and laid him in the earth without honor, removing any trace of his existence, just as the Bible had been defaced. Others countered that Eleanor, broken by years of silence, may have died within the manor and been buried in secret, denied the dignity of the family plot because of her notoriety. A few went further, suggesting she had taken her own life, and that such an act would have forced the Whitlocks to bury her away from consecrated ground. What unsettles most is the secrecy. No record of the grave exists in county ledgers. No church register marks the burial. Even those who worked the estate in its final years gave conflicting accounts, some recalling a hurried digging in the night, others claiming they had only heard the rumor after the fact. What remains is an absence too deliberate to be chance. Today, the grave is overgrown, nearly invisible unless one knows where to look. Travelers who stumble upon it rarely linger, sensing the weight of unresolved history pressing up from beneath the soil. Whether it holds Thomas, Eleanor, or neither, the truth lies sealed under that lonely mound, guarded by silence. In its anonymity, the grave speaks more loudly than any headstone could, a reminder that some stories end not with resolution, but with concealment, leaving only questions to grow where memory was meant to rest. Hollow Creek Manor stands today as little more than a husk, its columns cracked, its roof sagging beneath the weight of storms and years. Vines have crept across the stone, swallowing the veranda, and the windows gape hollow, their glass long since shattered by time or trespassers. Yet for all its decay, the house has not been forgotten. Travelers passing through the county give it wide berth, guiding their wagons or cars along longer routes to avoid its shadow. Those who live nearby speak of it reluctantly, lowering their voices when the subject arises, as though even the mention of its name might stir something still restless within its walls. The story of the Whitlocks has become more than local lore. It has taken on the shape of a cautionary tale, one whispered to children when they ask why the manor stands empty. They are told of Elias Whitlock, a man whose authority corroded into obsession, whose gaze lingered where it should not. They are told of Thomas, the heir who vanished, and of Eleanor, the bride who became a prisoner in her own home. And they are told that when a family poisons its own blood with desire, betrayal, and silence, it does not perish quietly, it leaves behind a curse that seeps into land and memory alike. For generations, the land around Hollow Creek has been marked by unease. Farmers who attempted to work its soil reported failed crops and restless livestock. Hikers who strayed too close to the ruins described hearing voices on the wind or the sound of footsteps pacing in the upper halls where no one lived. Paranormal enthusiasts have made pilgrimages to the site, eager for proof of haunting, yet many left shaken, refusing to return. A few even claimed they saw a woman in white at the creek's edge, her head bowed, her form dissolving into mist before she reached the water. But what lingers most is not the apparition of Eleanor, nor the mystery of Thomas's disappearance. It is the weight of the story itself. Hollow Creek is remembered not as legend, but as warning that unchecked power within a family can consume it from within. That silence can be as deadly as violence, and that desire, when turned toward the forbidden, leaves scars that no generation can heal. The curse of Hollow Creek is not confined to one house or one name. It endures in the telling, in the way neighbors still cross themselves when they pass its gates, in the way children are hushed when they ask too many questions. The manor rots, but its story lives. And in that story lies the true curse, that the Whitlocks will never be laid to rest, their fate bound forever to a house where love was twisted into possession and where a family destroyed itself from within.